Thresh'alar's docks smelled the way every port in every colony smelled, like rust, brine, fuel residue, and the particular brand of disappointment that clings to places where things arrive damaged and leave repaired just enough to not fall apart before the next stop. Sila's Cray had worked breakwater docks for 3 years, which was long enough to know which cargo platforms listed to the left, which docking clamps needed to be kicked twice before they engaged, and which species tipped generously, and which species considered the concept of tipping a moral failing. He was 31, built like someone who had spent his formative years hauling nets and swimming through currents that wanted to kill him, which he had, because he'd grown up on Earth's restored Pacific coast in a family that treated the ocean the way most families treated the backyard. His hands were calloused from salt and rope, and the particular abrasion that comes from grabbing wet metal in a hurry. He had lifeguard certification from Earth's Coastal Rescue Corps, a qualification that was completely useless on a colony world where the harbor water was considered sacred by one species, toxic by another, and recreationally inadvisable by the Colony Health Board. He kept the certification anyway, folded into his work locker alongside a photograph of his mother's fishing boat and a protein bar he kept forgetting to eat. His shift had ended 20 minutes ago. He was sitting on a mooring bollard near Pier 6, unlacing his boots because the left one had been rubbing his heel raw since morning, and he'd been ignoring it with the stubborn patience of a man who believed that acknowledging discomfort was the first step toward letting it win. The evening air was warm, carrying the metallic tang of Thresh'alar's atmosphere processors mixed with the organic brine of the harbor, and the twin suns were sinking toward the horizon in that slow, overlapping way that made sunsets on this world last nearly an hour, painting everything in shades of copper and bruised violet. He noticed the gathering the way you notice weather changing, not all at once but as a shift in pressure. The eastern end of the pier, normally quiet at this hour, was filling with bodies. Velhari, dozens of them, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who had somewhere specific to be. They were tall, most of them a full head above Sila's, with the lean builds and sharp features that made them look like they'd been designed by someone who valued efficiency over comfort. Their skin ranged from pale gray to deep slate, and in the fading light, the faint bioluminescent vein networks beneath their skin pulsed in synchronized rhythms that Sila's had learned to read as emotional states. Blue for calm, violet for agitation, white for something that didn't translate well but that a Velhari colleague had once described as the feeling before a necessary thing. They were pulsing white. Sila's paused with his boot half unlaced. His translator implant, a mid-grade commercial unit that handled Velhari reasonably well unless they spoke too fast or used archaic dialect, began picking up fragments from the crowd. Words surfaced like debris in moving water. Contamination, judgment, purity of line, correction. The tone was not celebratory. Sila's had heard Velhari celebrations. They involved rhythmic humming and a drink that tasted like liquid aluminum and an enthusiasm that could charitably be described as aggressive joy. This was something else. This was ritual, and it carried the weight of verdict. He stood up, one boot still unlaced, and walked toward the edge of Pier 6 where the railing overlooked the eastern waterfront. From there, he could see the crowd arranged in a semicircle around the harbor's edge, and at the center of that semicircle, a woman. She was Velhari, clearly, but the differences hit him before the similarities. She was tall, nearly his height, with a face that could pass for human if you didn't look too carefully, high cheekbones, full mouth, a jawline that carried the same elegant severity as the rest of her species. But her skin was lighter than any Velhari he'd seen, almost pearl white, and the vein network beneath it was wrong. Where other Velhari carried dim, orderly lines of bioluminescence, hers blazed in a dense, chaotic web of silver blue that pulsed out of sync with everyone around her, like a heartbeat that refused to match the room's rhythm. Her eyes were amber gold with horizontal irises that were dilated wide, and behind her ears, tracing along her temples, Thin ridges of bone curved upward like the vestigial memory of something ancient. Her hair fell in thick, dark violet braids down her back, almost black in the fading light. Her hands were bound. Her ankles were bound. The bioluminescent bindings wrapped around her wrists pulsed with someone else's rhythm, overriding her own, and Silas's translator caught the Velhari term for it, silencing cord, before his brain fully registered what it meant. They were going to throw her in. The water hit him like a fist made of cold and salt, and every bad decision he'd ever made compressed into a single moment of total sensory commitment. Silas Cray did not remember deciding to jump. He would replay this moment thousands of times in the years that followed, searching for the precise instant when conscious thought became physical action, and he would never find it. One second he was standing at the railing of Pier 6 with one boot unlaced, watching a bound woman arc through the air toward the harbor surface. The next second he was in the air himself, boots and all. The unlaced left one already working itself loose as gravity took over, and the mammalian dive reflex that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting kicked in with the mechanical certainty of a system that did not care about diplomatic protocols. He hit the water 3 seconds after she did. Thresh'alar's harbor was deep. The colony had been built around a natural inlet where the ocean floor dropped sharply, and the eastern waterfront where the Velhari had gathered sat above a stretch of water that went down 40 meters before it found anything resembling bottom. The water was cold, not dangerously so for a human, but enough to trigger the reflex cascade that his body had been trained to use rather than fight, heart rate dropping, blood redirecting to core organs, peripheral vessels constricting to conserve oxygen. His eyes adjusted faster than they should have in the murky brine, because he'd spent half his childhood diving in worse visibility off the Pacific coast, chasing abalone in kelp forests where the light came in like broken glass. He found her at 6 meters and sinking. Saron was conscious. That was the part that would stay with him. She was not thrashing, not flailing, not performing the panicked animal struggle that drowning humans exhibited. She was sinking with her amber eyes open, and her bound hands pressed against her chest, and her silver-blue veins blazing so bright that she lit the water around her like a living signal flare. And she was looking up at the surface, with an expression of such controlled, deliberate awareness that Silas understood immediately and horribly that Velhari lungs could not hold enough air to make this fast. She was going to be conscious for all of it. Her people knew that. That was the point. He reached her in 4 strokes. His hands found the bioluminescent bindings at her wrists and his fingers, trained on rope and rigging, and every kind of knot the ocean could throw at a rescue swimmer. Worked at the unfamiliar material with a frustrated efficiency that would have been funny under any other circumstance. A human dock worker trying to untie alien ceremonial restraints underwater like a man trying to open child-proof packaging during an emergency. The bindings didn't untie. They were biomechanical, fused to a frequency he couldn't interact with, so he did what he'd been trained to do when equipment failed. He improvised. He wrapped one arm around her torso, locked her against his chest, and kicked for the surface with the kind of power that only comes from legs that learned to fight riptides before they learned to ride a bicycle. They broke the surface together, and Silas hauled air into his lungs with the gasping efficiency of someone who had done this before, many times, in water that was trying harder to kill him than this. Saron choked, coughed, and made a sound that his translator could not process, but that his nervous system interpreted as pain mixed with bewilderment mixed with something dangerously close to hope. He sidestroked toward the nearest pier ladder, towing her with one arm, his unlaced boot now gone entirely, sacrificed to the harbor along with his shift schedule, his diplomatic neutrality, and any chance of a quiet evening. The scene on the pier was exactly as chaotic as he'd expected and considerably worse than he'd hoped. The Velhari crowd had surged to the water's edge, and their bioluminescent veins had shifted from white to a deep, angry crimson that pulsed in unison like a single furious heartbeat distributed across dozens of bodies. The sound they made was not shouting. Not exactly. Velhari vocal systems produced a harmonic layering that turned collective anger into something closer to a physical force, a wall of sound that vibrated in Silas's chest cavity and made his teeth ache. His translator, overwhelmed by the overlapping voices, spat fragments at him in garbled sequence. Sacrilege, water-touched, the dead do not return, human interference, abomination. Silas climbed the ladder one-handed, hauling Saron up with the other arm, and when he reached the top he set her down on the pier decking and stood between her and the crowd with the water streaming off him, and his one remaining boot squelching with every breath. A Velhari male stepped forward. He was older, his bioluminescent veins carrying the deep, slow pulse of authority, and he spoke in formal Velhari that Silas's translator handled with unusual clarity, probably because the words were chosen to be understood. The human had violated sacred correction. The female was water-touched. She was dead in law and spirit. By removing her from the water, the human had not saved her. He had created something that should not exist, a being with no legal standing, no family claim, no identity. And by Velhari customary law, the one who interfered with a correction bore full responsibility for the result. Silas, dripping wet, missing a boot, standing on a pier in front of a crowd that wanted to kill the woman behind him, processed this information with the slow, thorough calm of a man who had once been caught in a riptide for 45 minutes and had survived by refusing to panic on principle. "So she's my responsibility," he said. The elder confirmed. The human wanted to play rescuer, the human could keep what he'd rescued, but she was not Velhari anymore. She was nothing. And whatever problems her existence created were now his to carry alone. Silas looked down at Saron, who sat on the pier decking with her bound hands in her lap and harbor water streaming from her dark violet braids, and her amber eyes fixed on his face, with an expression that contained no expectation, no plea, no performance. Just the raw, exhausted attention of someone waiting to find out if the person who saved her body was also going to save the rest of her. "All right," Silas said. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without drama, and with the faint undertone of a man who had just realized his evening was going to be significantly more complicated than planned. He turned back to the elder. "Can someone at least get these bindings off her, or do I need to find a manual?" Nobody laughed, but Saron behind him made a sound that might have been one, small and broken, and startled out of her like something she had forgotten she could do. The container apartment on Block 9 of the dockworkers' residential quarter had been designed for one human occupant with modest expectations and no social life. It was 12 meters by 4, with a fold-down bunk, a sanitation unit that made optimistic promises about water pressure it could not keep, a cooking surface that heated unevenly, and had once set off the fire suppression system while Silas was making toast, and a single window that overlooked the cargo yard, and if you pressed your face to the glass at the right angle, a thin sliver of the harbor beyond. It smelled like engine grease, recycled air, and the particular metallic sweetness of Thresh'alar's atmosphere that never quite washed out of anything. Silas brought Saron here because he had nowhere else to bring her. The bindings had come off eventually, not through Velhari cooperation, but through Bria Lanik, the colony's human administrative coordinator, who had arrived at the pier 40 minutes after the incident with the expression of someone who had been woken from a nap to be told that the universe had decided to make her life worse. Bria was 46, built like a woman who had arm-wrestled bureaucracies on 5 colony worlds and won most of them, and she carried a multi-tool that she claimed was for administrative purposes, but that she had once used to disassemble a malfunctioning airlock panel during a pressure emergency. She took one look at the bioluminescent bindings, consulted her datapad, found the frequency override in a Velhari legal database that was technically restricted, but that Bria accessed with the cheerful disregard of someone who believed that rules were guidelines written by people who had never been in a real emergency, and deactivated them. Saron had not spoken during any of this. She sat where Silas placed her, moved where he guided her, and watched everything with those amber gold eyes that tracked every motion in the room with the hypervigilant attention of someone who had learned that stillness was safer than movement. The silver-blue vein network beneath her skin had dimmed since the water, pulsing in low, irregular rhythms that Silas couldn't read, but that reminded him, uncomfortably, of a pulse that was trying to steady itself after a shock. Now she sat on the edge of his fold-down bunk, wrapped in the only clean blanket he owned, which was a gray thermal weave with a coffee stain on one corner that he'd been meaning to wash for 2 weeks. And she looked at the interior of his apartment with an expression that he could not decipher but suspected was somewhere between exhaustion and the particular disorientation of finding yourself alive in a place you never expected to be. Silas made tea. He did this not because he thought tea would fix anything, but because it was the only social protocol he reliably understood. And when the universe presented him with a problem too large for immediate solution, his hands defaulted to the kettle the way other people's hands defaulted to prayer. He set a cup in front of her, realized he had no idea if Velhari could drink earth tea, checked with Bria via comm message, received a response that said probably fine, don't give her caffeine, also what the hell is wrong with you, and removed the tea bag after a cautiously short steep. I don't know what happens now, he told her honestly, sitting on the floor across from the bunk because the apartment did not contain a second chair, and he had never felt the need to own one until this moment. I don't know your language well enough to explain things properly. My translator is. He paused, searching for the diplomatic version of the truth. Not great. Saron looked at him. Then she spoke, and her voice was lower than he expected, carrying the harmonic layering that all Velhari voices had, but with an undertone that resonated differently, a frequency his translator struggled with but his chest felt. His implant processed the words slowly, haltingly, and delivered them with the confidence of a student reading aloud from a textbook they had not studied. Your device translates adequately, she said. I have heard worse from trade merchants who claimed fluency. It was not a joke, exactly, but it was adjacent to one, delivered with the precision of someone testing whether humor still worked after everything else had been stripped away. Silas felt something in his chest loosen slightly, the way a knot loosens when you find the right strand to pull. Over the following days, the shape of their situation became clearer and considerably worse. Bria laid it out during a meeting in her office, which was a slightly larger container unit that she had furnished with the aggressive pragmatism of someone who expected to be reassigned within the year and did not believe in decorating temporary spaces. Saron legally did not exist. Velhari law was unambiguous. Water-touched individuals were dead. Not metaphorically dead, not socially dead, but dead in every legal framework the Velhari operated within. Her identity records had been dissolved. Her family bonds were severed. Her genetic registry entry, the document that, in Velhari society, functioned as birth certificate, social security number, and proof of personhood combined, had been marked with the symbol for cessation, which Bria's translator rendered, with characteristic bluntness, as file closed. She could not return to Velhari territory. She could not access Velhari medical systems. She could not work under Velhari employment classifications. And under the colony treaty, Velhari internal legal matters were sovereign, meaning the colony administration could not override the death declaration without triggering a diplomatic incident that Bria described as the kind of headache that ends careers and starts wars, in that order. Silas asked what options they had. Bria told him there was exactly one. Saron could be registered as a dependent under Silas's colonial residency, a classification normally used for minor children and occasionally for refugees from uncontacted species, which would give her basic legal existence within the human administrative framework while neatly sidestepping the Velhari system entirely. The catch was that this made Sela's legally responsible for her welfare, her conduct, and any consequences of her continued existence, which the Velhari community was already making clear they considered an ongoing provocation. So I'm basically her. Sela's searched for the word, guardian sponsor, and the only reason she has a pulse that anyone with a badge is willing to acknowledge, Bria said. Congratulations. You wanted to be a hero, now you get to do the paperwork. It was during the second week that Sela's discovered what Saron's mutation actually did. He had brought back a small herb planter from the dock market. Basil, thyme, and something the vendor had called colony mint, that tasted like regular mint had been raised in a hostile environment and developed a personality because of it. He set it on the windowsill because the apartment needed something alive in it that wasn't confused and traumatized. And the following morning, the basil had doubled in size. By the third morning, the thyme had overflowed its container. The hearing took place in Thresh'alar's central council chamber, a circular structure at the colony's administrative core that had been designed with the optimistic assumption that the species sharing this world would eventually learn to occupy the same room without incident. The chamber was tiered, with seating sections calibrated to the atmospheric preferences of each resident species, which meant the room simultaneously maintained 4 different temperature zones, 3 different humidity levels, and a persistent draft near the Moltari section that nobody had been able to fix in 6 years, and that the Moltari had, with characteristic stubbornness, declared a cultural feature rather than an engineering failure. Every seat was occupied. Representatives from all 7 treaty species sat in their designated sections, and the observation galleries above were packed with colony residents who had heard about the human dock worker, the dead Velhari woman, and the diplomatic catastrophe that was somehow still unfolding 3 weeks after a man with 1 boot jumped into a harbor. The story had spread through Thresh'alar the way all good stories spread through small communities. Quickly, inaccurately, and with embellishments that grew more dramatic with each retelling. By the time it reached the council chamber, the narrative had acquired details that Sela's did not recognize, including a version where he had fought off 12 Velhari guards with his bare hands, which was flattering but bore no resemblance to reality, since the actual event had involved 0 fighting and a significant amount of confused treading water. The Velhari delegation sat in the eastern tier, led by Elder Vorath, the same male who had confronted Sela's on the pier. His bioluminescent veins pulsed with the slow, deep cadence of formal authority, and his opening statement, delivered in a Velhari so precise that even Sela's mediocre translator rendered it cleanly, laid out the charges with surgical efficiency. The human Sela's Cray had violated Velhari sovereign tradition. He had interfered with a lawful correction. He had created an anomalous legal entity by removing a water-touched individual from the harbor. The Velhari sovereignty demanded that the death declaration be upheld, that Saron's colonial registration be dissolved, and that Sela's face formal censure for cultural interference under Article 14 of the Colony Treaty. Sela's sat in the respondents section wearing his cleanest work clothes, which were still noticeably work clothes, and the replacement boots he'd bought from a cargo surplus vendor who had given him a discount after hearing the story, saying it was the least she could do for a man who'd lost footwear in the service of what she called aggressive decency. Saron sat beside him, dressed in borrowed human clothing because Velhari garments were no longer available to her, and her silver-blue veins pulsed in tight, controlled patterns that Sela's had learned to recognize as the Velhari equivalent of someone clenching their jaw to keep from screaming. When it was his turn to speak, Sela's stood and looked at the council with the unhurried calm that every person who had ever worked with him recognized as his natural state. Not performed confidence, not bravado, but the genuine steadiness of a man who had spent his life in environments where panic killed faster than the actual danger. "I saw someone drowning," he said. "I jumped in. That's not a cultural statement. That's not a political act. Where I come from, if someone's in the water, you go get them. It doesn't matter who they are or why they're there. You go get them because they're drowning and you can swim." He paused and looked at the Velhari delegation with an expression that contained no hostility but also no apology. "I understand that I broke your tradition. I understand that you consider her dead. But I pulled a living woman out of water that was killing her, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend that was wrong, because my species spent 100,000 years evolving to do exactly what I did, and I'm not going to apologize for being what I am any more than you'd apologize for being what you are." The chamber was quiet in the way that spaces become quiet when someone has said something simple enough to be understood by everyone and uncomfortable enough that nobody wants to be the first to respond. Then Bria Lannick stood from the human administrative section, and with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 3 weeks and had the documentation to prove it, presented the findings. Sauron's mutation was not a contamination. It was a known but extremely rare Velhari genetic variant that appeared roughly once every 12 generations, documented in Velhari scientific literature, that the current cultural leadership had classified and suppressed because it contradicted the purity doctrine that underpinned their social structure. The variant produced enhanced bioluminescent resonance capable of stimulating biological growth and cellular repair in surrounding organisms. Bria projected the data onto the chamber's central display. The herb planter's growth rates, the soil samples from the dock garden where Sauron had been spending her afternoons, the measurable increase in crop yields in the agricultural plots adjacent to her usual walking path. The numbers were not subtle. They were the kind of numbers that made agricultural scientists sit up very straight and start making urgent calls to their colleagues. The Velhari delegation fractured visibly. Elder Voreth's veins shifted through 3 colors in rapid succession, a display of emotional conflict that Velhari etiquette considered deeply embarrassing and that he could not suppress. The younger Velhari representatives in the back rows leaned forward with expressions that Silas recognized from his own species, the look of people realizing they had been lied to by the people they trusted. The chamber erupted into debate that lasted 4 hours and involved 7 translation teams, 2 recesses, 1 near-physical altercation between a Velhari elder and a Velhari junior diplomat that was broken up by a Moltari security officer who found the whole situation entertaining, and a moment where Bria Lannick slammed her datapad on the table so hard that the screen cracked and then continued presenting from memory without missing a word. The council's decision came at the 7th hour. Sauron was granted colonial citizenship under a new legal classification that Bria had drafted specifically for this case, and that she had titled, with characteristic bluntness, "Persons of Recovered Status." The Velhari death declaration was not overturned. The council lacked jurisdiction for that, but it was rendered functionally irrelevant within colony boundaries. Silas's guardianship was maintained, modified from emergency custody to formal sponsorship, and the cultural interference charges were dismissed on the grounds that, as the Moltari representative put it with barely concealed amusement, the human was simply being a human, and we do not prosecute species for their instincts, or half this council would be in prison. Silas and Sauron walked back to the docks as the twin suns set in their long, overlapping descent. They walked in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the preceding weeks, the kind of silence that exists between people who have passed through something together and no longer need to fill every moment with sound to prove they are not alone. Sauron's silver-blue veins pulsed in a slow, warm rhythm that Silas had not seen before, something gentler and steadier than her usual patterns, and he noticed that the weeds growing between the pier planks seemed slightly taller as she passed, leaning toward her the way plants lean toward light. At the end of Pier 6, where it had all started, They sat on the edge with their legs hanging over the water. Scylla's had both boots this time. The harbor below reflected the copper-violet sky in long, rippling bands, and somewhere in the dock market behind them, a vendor was arguing with a Moltari customer about the freshness of imported fruit, in a tone that suggested both parties were enjoying the fight more than they would admit. "Why did you jump?" Saron asked. Her voice carried its harmonic undertone, and his translator had improved enough, or perhaps he had simply learned enough of her, that he heard the question beneath the question. Not why did you save me, but why did you choose the version of your life that includes me in it? Silas thought about it. He watched the water move below them, the same water that had tried to kill her, and that he had entered without thinking, and he tried to find the honest answer rather than the convenient one. "I don't know," he said. "My body moved before my brain caught up. That's the truth. I didn't decide to save you. I just could not." He paused and then added with the faint, crooked half-smile that she had come to understand was his version of vulnerability, "I think my species is just wired badly. We see someone going under and something in us says go. And by the time we think about whether it's a good idea, we're already wet." Saron was quiet for a long moment. Her amber eyes watched the harbor with an expression that had evolved over these weeks from vigilance to something closer to rest, and the bioluminescent lines along her jaw pulsed once in a pattern that Silas had been studying Velhari emotional lexicons long enough to recognize, though he would not tell her that for several more months. It meant safe. Not the Velhari word for safety as a concept, but the older, deeper word, the one that meant the danger has passed and I am still here, and the person beside me is the reason. She reached down and pressed her palm flat against the pier decking. Beneath her fingers, in the cracks between the old planks, something stirred. A thin green shoot pushed through the gap, then another, then a third, curling upward with a speed that was gentle but unmistakable, reaching toward the fading light with the blind, patient certainty of living things that do not know they are supposed to be impossible. Silas watched the shoots emerge and felt something settle in his chest that he had not known was unsettled. He did not say anything. Some things did not need language, or translation, or harmonic resonance to be understood. Some things just grew, quietly and without permission, in the spaces where someone had been brave enough to make room. The twin suns touched the horizon and the long sunset began, and on Pier 6 of Breakwater Docks, a man and a woman who should never have met sat together while the cracks in the wood between them filled, slowly and certainly, with green.